Well, thank you all for joining today. And hello, I'm Phil Carvil. I work as the Health Tech Cluster Manager for the Science and Technology Facilities Council, one of the 9 organisations which make up UK research and innovation. Personally, I've been with SCFC for 2 years. I also work with Pride in STEM, a charitable trust run by an independent group of LGBTQ plus STEM professionals. So, as it's Pride Month, as part of UKRI's Take Pride in Research and Innovation campaign, I'm here virtually with some fantastic colleagues from different organisations to have an open discussion about some of the challenges faced by LGBT people in the research and innovation sector, share our experiences, our observations, and really just open that dialogue. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you one by one to introduce yourselves and where you're from. So can I start and invite, please, Izzy to kick us off?
So my name is Dr Izzy Jayasinghe. I'm a UKRI Future Leader Fellow. I'm based in the University of Sheffield. I also work with a few organisations that champion LGBTQI plus inclusion. So I work with LGBTQ plus STEM, Tiger in STEM, and I also work with the Women in Physics group in the Institute of Physics.
Perfect. Thank you, Izzy. Tom, if I can invite you to introduce yourself.
So hello, I'm Professor Tom Welton. I'm Professor of Sustainable Chemistry at Imperial College. And in a few days' time, after a year of waiting, I will be becoming the next president of the Royal Society of Chemistry, to which I was elected. And of course, part of that election was diversity.
Thank you, Tom, and congratulations for that position and the upcoming appointment. And Harsh, lastly, if I can ask you to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harsh Pershad. I identify as a gay man, as a British Indian. I am an innovation lead at Innovate UK, part of UK Research and Innovation. I also identify as a scientist, an artist, a musician, a dancer. But really, my main focus, especially in the workplace, is being passionate about science and research and applying that to solve societal problems, particularly climate change.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. That was such an eclectic and diverse mix of backgrounds there, activities you're all involved in, and particularly identities as well. So I think that's really set up my next question. So I'm really interested to hear about everyone's experience of getting into research and innovation. Was it your childhood dream? Did you accidentally fall into it? Was it a straightforward university trajectory? Let's mix up the order. So actually, Harsh, I'm going to start with you this time. Tell me about your experiences and journey.
Sure. So thanks, Phil. I had always wanted to become a scientist. I was lucky to do my undergraduate degree at Imperial College and was lectured by Tom, in fact, for my final year, which was very exciting. I went on to do a PhD and a couple of postdocs. And I think what was really interesting then for me was the jump into industry that I made when I was about 30 years old. And I got to work for a consultancy that was working on climate change and low carbon strategies. And I found that I could bring all of my research experience, my chemistry training, my scientific approach to trying to help people make better decisions on energy. And then I found that I could work with lots of different people rather than being focused on one narrow area. So it was very exciting for me to get to join UK Research and Innovation about 5 years ago. And since then, I've been able to work on all of my favourite chemical technologies, but apply them to tackle climate change. So it's been a really interesting journey so far.
Perfect. Thank you, Harsh, sharing that experience. And obviously, really interesting journey there, going from the academic. And actually fantastic to hear about the interactions with the group here already. So I'm sure we can delve into that a bit later on. Izzy, if I can invite you to tell us and share your journey experiences.
I had an interest in science from a very young age, and that's probably helped by the fact that both my parents worked in STEM, so medicine and engineering. But science was sort of a distant dream, and it remained that way until my final year in school, when I did a project in physics where I built my little apparatus, and that project sort of grew into a bit of a monster, and that was sort of then put forward to the science fair, the local science fair, which won me a scholarship to go to university to study science. And that kind of whetted my, appetite to, in terms of research and sort of designing your own experiment. And I've kind of really never looked back, and I've done taken the typical path of doing a PhD, and that's taken me halfway around the world. So I did my PhD in Auckland in New Zealand, and I did a postdoc in Queensland in Australia, and then another postdoc in Exeter in the UK. And that's sort of taken me on a journey to becoming an independent researcher. And now I'm sort of delving slightly into industry and exploring my commercial options. But I've kind of worked primarily as a scientist, sort of a kind of blue sky scientist, and now sort of a tech developer.
Perfect. Thank you, Izzy, there. And fantastic to hear almost your global story of how you've undertaken research and innovation. So some really interesting experiences we can delve into there as to how we might marry up with other sort of research and innovation ecosystems. Tom, lastly, if I can invite you just to share your experiences, please.
So before I say this, I think I should say I am extraordinarily happy with the way my career has turned out to be, and the choices that I ended up making turned out very luckily to be the right ones. But actually my career has been very much linear academic conveyor belt, I think you can call it. And a big part of the reason for that, certainly early on, was that I didn't know that there was any alternative. And so I grew up on a North London council estate, and luckily I went to a very good, supportive secondary school, and I became interested in science as a youngster largely through James Burke, which I'm probably the only one of us that's old enough to remember, and his television programmes. And so I was interested in science. I liked chemistry at school, and I didn't know that you could do science in a way which wasn't the way that it was done at school. So I thought, your options for science at university would be chemistry, biology and physics, and I didn't know that something like pharmacology existed. And so I didn't have the choice to do something I didn't know existed. I picked from the ones that I did know existed what my favourite was. It was chemistry. And I went to the University of Sussex, where I really enjoyed myself. But again, there was kind of, other than going into marketing for a drug company, I wasn't really aware of non-scientific, non-conveyor belt careers, and so I just stuck with the conveyor belt. Now, as it happens, I think if I had known about those alternatives, the conveyor belt was still the right place for me, but that was a bit of luck as opposed to judgment.
Okay, that's really interesting reflections there, sort of a linear conveyor belt career, knowing that and not knowing or being aware about some of the other opportunities. And actually that really opens up the question of going, do you think the research and innovation sector, how is it generally perceived? Because from your sort of discussion there, there's awareness of a very linear sector, working in a lab, do you think it's now becoming more of a welcoming, diverse sector where people are aware of these opportunities, but also sort of richness of ideas and trajectories coming in? Or do you think there's still a perception that it's exclusive? So, Harsh, would you like to give maybe some reflections on this from your side?
So I think that, for better or for worse, a lot of the research environment that I remember was a fairly conservative sector, in that if you followed the path that your lecturers had followed, it felt like the done thing to do. There was a kind of a cultural norm around it. And as Thomas mentioned, I think unless you hear from other voices that there are alternatives, you wouldn't necessarily know that. And even if you know that, convincing other people to take risks with you it can be quite hard, and it's hard. It's really interesting to think how much progress there's been, because I remember when I applied for my postdoc, I'd been working during my PhD at Oxford on nickel enzymes, and I went to do a postdoc in University of California in Berkeley, in the US, on copper enzymes. And I had a reviewer that had reviewed my grant, and he said, I'm not sure that Harsh will be able to make the huge jump from nickel enzymes to copper enzymes. And it's kind of just very illustrative of the that actually nowadays that things have really changed. I can't imagine anything like that nowadays. Today, every researcher I meet is absolutely wedded to the fact that new ideas will come from collaborating outside of your current sector, that societal challenges require you to jump out of the training that you had in your degree. So data science is just as important to chemistry as meteorology. So I think there's been a real revolution in that, and I think that's really helped the culture. So I find it a much more welcoming sector that I interact with a lot, and I think that can be really interesting.
No, it's really interesting, it's particularly on that sort of collaboration thought process, how in now collaborating is seen as the way forward to really creating new partnerships and research ideas. And I know we've got some really interesting international sort of flavours to people's experiences here. So I wonder if I could touch upon that sort of nuances in your experiences. So similar sort of question on the perception of the research innovation sector and how it's changed. What's your reflection on that, given that you've had that very much international flavour to your career?
The very early sort of impression that I had in my mind about science or a career in science was that it was a way to see the world. It was a way to work with people from diverse backgrounds. And this is the dream that you kind of, or at least I kind of had when I was a graduate student. That, you know, you get to go to conferences overseas and you get to work with people whose work you read on paper. And there is some truth to it. There is, you know, certainly it's expanded my horizons, you know, geographically as well as culturally. I've, you know, gotten to know a lot more about people in the world. But in other ways, you know, it's been quite limited because, you know, the role models that you get to commonly look up to tend to be, you know, cis white men, you know, 9 times out of 10. And that was the case, you know, when I was a graduate student and a sort of a young postdoc. And that is a situation that is changing.
That's really interesting there, hearing some of those limitations as well going, but also how those are shifting. So let's, if we can pick on that a little bit more about how things are shifting and what maybe we can do to change sort of those historic perceptions, as it were, as to research innovation, those role models. Oh, what do you think, Tom? Considering now you're going to this very high level elected position, the Royal Society of Chemistry, what do you think we can do to sort of change some of those perceptions to help people look beyond those previous perceptions of what a scientist STEM professional is?
So I think the first thing that we need to address, and I think we are addressing it slowly, is the idea of there being a diversity of successes. I think certainly when I was a student, the way in which we felt, and I would go as far as say the way in which we were made to feel, was that continuation of the academic pathway was success. And if you failed at that, you might go and do something else like work in industry or take up some other kind of position. But the idea that there is only one kind of success, I think, is extremely limiting in many different kinds of ways. Because, of course, it limits the choices that we might make as individuals. But also, not just because of that, I think that, you know, diversity in the other way in which we talk about diversity, the diversity of peoples, would be more liberated in its implementation if we recognise that actually there are many ways of being successful, all of which should be equally respected, and then the both types of diversity could move forward together.
Perfect, thank you. That's, again, you know, going on that sort of trajectory that potentially that sort of academic career isn't the only one you can do, and really trying to open it up and bringing that diversity to that sort of trajectory, I think could have enormous impact. And actually that leads on perfectly to my next sort of question, really. So if we look more closely at that element, at that research and innovation sector, as you say, often there's that need to focus on the science, that academic career, as you say, with a person with a PhD going into an academic position purely on their work. But when you think about those people, those scientists, they are people at the end of the day. They're not just process focused all the time. So why do you think it's important that everyone feels comfortable to bring their whole self to work with them? And how does that actually resonate with what was just said there about sort of that diversity of people and diversity of positions within the research and innovation sector? Tom, shall we continue on that thread and then go round? So any reflections there?
Okay, so when I'm thinking about the discussion of bringing one's whole self to work, for me personally, and I think for many people, the thing that requires effort and activity isn't bringing your whole self to work. The thing that would require effort and activity would be not bringing your whole self to work, because you would be having to actively cover something up. By not doing that, I liberated that energy to be able to be used on actually, part of it, making me a better scientist. And so I think it's absolutely vital that people do not waste their time and energy pretending to be something they're not.
Excellent. Again, such an impactful statement there. And I think that sort of paradigm around that whole self to work and how that impacts on your energy as a professional. I'd love to delve into a few more of those nuances with the other panelists. So, Izzy, do you have any reflections on that yourself, particularly in how it impacts the research innovation sector?
I again echo everything that Tom said. I came out as a trans woman about 11 years ago to my closest friends, but then I found myself going back into the closet, and I think the reason for that was mainly the insecurities around career and security and that kind of thing. And so I didn't really again come out until I had my first faculty position. And I completely relate to the idea that you're compartmentalizing, you're working, you're not working on all cylinders, you're basically underpowered. But also it impacts negatively in the sense that that you're not being authentic and true of who you are with your friends, your colleagues, and that is a real handicap sometimes.
No, absolutely. I think that highlights there's still some opportunities to really delve into, to open up for particularly early career professionals, as well as sort of the wider community and sector as a whole. Izzy, do you have any more reflections on that sort of point at all?
I just want to add that the thing that eventually catalyzed the decision to actually be out was actually seeing others like myself, sort of trans people who were getting on with their scientific careers. So I think it can work both ways. It could be disheartening to see that you're yourself in the closet while the others are out, but at the same time it can catalyze change in a more positive sense. And I'm glad that I got to know people like that.
Absolutely. And let's just finish this train of thought with yourself, Harsh. Obviously, again, with your reflections on your career, you've gone from academic and industry, and also in terms of the people you've interacted with along that journey and colleagues going, what's your reflection, that whole bringing your whole self to work paradigm and how that shaped your career, as well as where you see it in the current climate of the research and innovation sector?
Thanks, Phil. So my views on this have changed quite a bit. I think right at the beginning of my career, I used to want, in fact, that being gay would be should be a small compartment of my life that didn't have any impact on my work, and vice versa. But now I realise that I think being gay affects many parts, possibly every part of my life, including my work. So in terms of the decisions I've made, for example, choosing safe places to work, safe places to live, has been really important. And I think that one of the things that drives a perception of safety, real or imagined, is visibility, as Izzy has said, of people that one can relate to. And I think that that's been really important for me. And it's one of the reasons why initially I wasn't sure about participating in this podcast, but actually thinking about the need for visibility, or the value of visibility has how it's helped me in the past, made me think, okay, this is something that I could engage with. But I think, like Izzy's mentioned, it's very easy to step back into a closet mode, or because we live in very dynamic work environments nowadays. People change jobs and working patterns very often. We're frequently attending, say, for example, a conference or a working group where you really are meeting people in a very narrow construct. And so it can be difficult to bring all of yourself to those conversations, even though you might hear others at the meeting being very comfortable with that. So I find that's constantly interesting.
No, absolutely. And I've really resonated with some of those views about compartmentalizing. You know, you would think going, oh, being gay would be just that's one element, and then I'm working. And I've been guilty of that in myself in my sort of journey as well, of thinking going, I'll address being gay later, but I've got to do my job now. So, and it's really interesting to see how that's changed now, both as I personally have changed as well over my life, as well as, you know, observing that as well. So I'd love to delve on, you know, just personally as well, into what do you think are some of the ways the research and innovation sector can better support the LGBT community? So I don't know if there's anyone who would like to start on that one.
Okay, I'll start with this. My personal view is that if you want to build visibility and inclusion in sort of a STEM environment, you need to lift the barriers that are preventing these minorities from accessing funding. And now the UKRI at the moment is going through a review of things like success rates in funding applications across in terms of characteristics like, you know, gender, in terms of race. That kind of data don't exist for LGBTQI people. And so we haven't even admitted that there might be a problem. And I think that identifying if there's a problem and lifting those barriers will, first and foremost, will help LGBTQI people progress in scientific and technology careers. Both the visibility and the presence and the access for these communities in STEM research and innovation.
No, I think those are some fantastic things referenced there, the ongoing reviews, how it's been done in those other sort of communities, and how that data isn't actually there for the research innovation sector yet, potentially for us to action. So, Tom, I wonder if you had some commentary as well, you know, based on what Izzy was saying there about how we can improve the research innovation sector for this community.
So I think one of the things that, you know, over the lifetime of my career, formal procedures have changed in a positive way. I had friends who lost jobs, were taken off of projects because they were LGBT plus, and, you know, that was a perfectly legal thing to do. And those kinds of procedures were in place in places. Now they're not. You know, the procedures, the laws, all those kinds of things are in place to prevent those kinds of things from happening. But then, of course, you get the actual practices that people experience on the ground. And in a way, that's the toughest nut to crack, because you can't do it just by making a diktat that this shall happen. And it is about a community response. It is about a cultural response. It is about people being inclusive. And, you know, and it's not in itself that difficult. Being inclusive starts with being welcoming. And, you know, and we are all capable of doing that. And I would say, you know, of anybody whose experience is different to mine, for whatever reason that might be, that welcoming first starts with listening. Just listening and hearing what those different experiences were. And do you know what? I think a lot of people get very nervous about being curious. And I can tell the difference between when somebody is being curious as to how my experience is different to them, and when somebody is being bloody nosy. And I would say to people, don't be frightened of being curious. Ask. If you're wondering, does that feel different for you? Ask, does it feel different for you? And be willing to listen to the answer. And so I think on that kind of community level, those are the kinds of things that will really make a difference to how comfortable someone feels, how welcomed they feel into the environment, and then ultimately how included in the projects and etc. that they are.
Absolutely. And I think that as researchers, STEM professionals, curiosity, I believe, is firmly embedded into who we are as people, curious, asking questions, particularly where we've been talking about the research and innovation sector, our experiences, the barriers, what we could maybe be tackling. Because this is the pandemic this year, Pride's year is obviously very different to what it usually is. We'll also see an incredibly important moment as well, as we've touched on, in terms of the fight for racial equality with the Black Lives Matter movement. So what do you think we can do to better support the Black community and create pathways for Black researchers and also more diversity in the research and innovation sectors, particularly to succeed? We talked about a bit earlier, so Izzy, about some of those the reviews going on within UKRI. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think this is a really good opportunity to have a really good self-reflection of how we as a research and innovation community look in terms of diversity. And one thing that was really striking that occurred to me, that there are no queer people of colour in the professorial level in the UK in STEM. And we talked about how few Black professors there are in general. And this is a really good time to actively think about what we can do to lift the barriers, to allow these people from different communities, different life experiences to progress and share their experiences.
No, I think that's a great sort of reflection there. One of the things we touched upon earlier was that visibility. So seeing fantastic role models in those positions and having, those inspiring you. So actually, I'd like to almost go back a little bit in sort of our thought process. For all of you here going, who were those sort of role models for you? Did you have an LGBTQ plus role model that inspired you? I'm going to go in reverse. Harsh, going from your experience, was there a role model? Was there someone you looked up to?
It took a while, and actually one of my fellow panellists, Tom Welton, was the very first person that I knew as being an out gay man in science, full stop. That was in 1996, and then even after that, I'd only ever seen a few LGBTQI individuals at the very junior levels, or even BAME people at very junior levels, very few at middle levels. And of course, if there aren't many at middle levels, then of course there won't be many at senior levels. And that's in research, that's in business, it's in government, it's in all of the sectors that I've worked in, and I've seen lots of data that reinforces what Izzy's been saying about that we're making some progress in small areas, but I don't know if we're really shifting the needle in terms of having a broad level of visibility of LGBTQI individuals. And I think that there's quite a lot that we can still do. I mean, people sometimes forget that freedoms won through a lot of hard work can be easily lost when you take your foot off the gas. So I think we shouldn't forget the courage of those who are willing to put themselves out there at the beginning, and the courage of those people who then follow on, and the courage of those people who follow after them, because I think that's really important.
I'm seeing a lot of nods here on the screen, and I think, if we even now, if we think about Pride, that all comes, a lot of it comes from the Stonewall riots, the courageous, efforts which were happening then in terms of really championing that movement, making progress and resisting, saying there needs to be change. Do you think that recognition is still there? Do you think more needs to be done in that space? Are we recognizing these fantastic role models, or the impact that these courageous people are having enough in progressing the equality movement forward? So anyone have sort of reflections on that at all? Tom?
Yes, this kind of matters to me. And for much of my career, I was just, oh my God, I'm it. That it's me. Although there were people around who were perhaps not quite as loud as me, but certainly I couldn't see in advance of where at no point in my career could I see in advance of where I was someone that I could say, oh, they're in the place I was trying to get to. That person never existed. But I would say there are two elements of it. So we have talked about, what we, the scientific community, can do about it. But I think that we do have to really think very seriously and take a very serious look at ourselves as the LGBT plus community and say, who is it that we choose to celebrate? And every year in one newspaper or another, at this time of year, you will get a list of the 50 most influential LGBT plus people in the country or in the world or whatever they decide to list it as. And you look down that list and you don't see a single scientist. And it's not now because those scientists don't exist. It's because we as a community do not value their contribution to society. So we as a community really need to take a good hard look at ourselves and say, what is it that we are valuing? How come this list has got, a dozen cabaret performers on it and not one single scientist?
I think that's an exceptionally important point there, particularly the value that we're putting on specific labels or specific professions. I mean, I think this blends on beautifully to the next point. I mean, do we think that equality, diversity and inclusion needs to be looked at, as we talked about earlier, in a more intersectional way rather than just one group? It needs to actually, we need to open up a bit more and start raising up some of these role models. So Izzy, do you have any commentary on this at all?
Yes, so I think there's definitely more things that we as a community, the LGBTQI community, can gain by opening up and celebrating the intersections. There's an incredible amount of resilience that we can actually gain as a community if we actually look across the board to some of the hardships that other groups have had historically. So one example is the discussion around whether trans women and non-binary folk should be allowed in what we call safe spaces. This is a discussion that is not new. It happened many decades ago to the Black American community. So at present day, talking about the rights of trans people, don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to look across, bring those experiences along and understand how that resilience and resistance was developed and how we can talk to the society broadly and bring in support.
Some incredible points there, particularly about how we can learn. Well, so this isn't a new thing. It has happened before in other communities, and really taking that learning, taking those experiences, recognize they happened, and then actually think about where they're happening now, where we can actually champion and move things forward, particularly, say, going in the transactional rights, the visibility in that community, and really think what action can be taken. I think that sort of, almost encapsulates it to looking at the whole sort of acronym, really, LGBTQ+. What are some of the differences in equality within that community, and how can we in both society and our sector work to improve that? I wonder, Tom and Harsh, if you have any sort of comments at all from what you've observed. Do you have any reflections at all on that?
Yeah, so intersectionality can be approached in two different kinds of ways, one of which I think is extraordinarily positive, which we've just heard from Izzy, which is about understanding how we are all multidimensional beings and that we can bring ourselves together around that idea. Or it can be, let's break ourselves down into ever more precisely defined groups that we use as a vehicle to separate ourselves from each other. And that is incredibly damaging and does nobody any good, because we are in fact all complex, multidimensional beings, and that's hugely positive.
No, perfect. That's extremely powerful. And as you say, we start bringing in this sort of intersectionality, to it. I think that, that opens up even more. So I'd actually like to bring this to a close and actually just ask one question to each of you and just ask for your reflections. So this is, STEM professionals, and that includes, the spectrum of STEM, from the arts and humanities to the particle physics to the engineering, mathematics, so why is it important as that sort of diverse, rich research innovation sector to be visible and support Pride in support of all this? Harsh, do you want to start for us?
I think this goes to the heart of why we're talking today. And for me, we've learnt very brutally, it feels, with the coronavirus pandemic, that only when all parts of society act together based on the best available evidence can we ensure that all of society benefits. And the LGBTQI community and BAME minorities in the UK, or women in innovation and research, are just as much part of the solution. And if you don't engage everyone, you won't end up with the full solution. So I think it's really about maximising the ideas at the table, their execution, and also their adoption by society.
Perfect. And if I can invite Izzy next, and then Tom, if that's okay. Izzy.
I think it's a really good opportunity that we have right now, where we've, as a community, worked to a level where there is some visibility within the community itself. But I think the next step is to open the door and allow that visibility to inspire more people to come through. And one thing that I learned when I was transitioning gender, the idea that, not running away from my past and living my true self in the present will hopefully help someone else, stop hiding from their future. And I think what we are seeing now in the 21st century is, some new generations coming into their prime in very difficult circumstances. The least we can do is open the door to the research and innovation in a community so that they don't have to hide a part of themselves and tackle the big problems of tomorrow and not having to compartmentalize and hide behind various things.
Fantastic. Resonate with everything you were saying there, and that opening that door. And Tom, going with that door wide open, what do you think?
Okay, so follow that. All I can really do, honestly, is agree with both Izzy and Harsh that, it isn't just a matter of we are facing the most incredibly complex problems that the world needs to solve, and you need the best possible collection of minds in order to do that. And so functionally, you better be inclusive, because that's what you need. There are generations and generations to come, and they do need to be inspired into wanting to work on those kinds of problems. They do need to be inspired into wanting to become a scientist, an engineer, or a musician or artist, whatever it is that they find inspiration in. And to do that, you have to be visible. Things are way better than they used to be, but equally well, that doesn't mean that we've completed our path down whichever way we are going to end up going, and we do need to carry on.
No, and I think to bring all those points together, I think anything we doing all we can to really sort of acknowledge, that sort of path that we all had, sharing those experiences, raising that sort of visibility, going and acknowledging it hasn't been enough, and we can do more. It's not just now, it's for the future, to inspire that next generation to really work on those problems. No matter where we are in our career, we should always be proud of who we are. We should always still be curious, and should always try and bring ourselves more together. So I want to actually personally thank each and every one of you, Izzy, Tom, Harsh, for sharing your stories, being visible, and that absolutely fantastic conversation. So thank you everyone who's contributed today, both yourselves and everyone behind the scenes as well. And it's been great to have this conversation. And I look forward to having the conversation again, moving it forward, and to seeing what we can really do to bring about better and greater change to really lead to world-leading impact, research and innovation, and a fantastic dance along the way. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.